How many times have you asked yourself why certain things always slip away, even when they reach close enough to graze your skin? What if I told you the world didn't betray you, but that you broke a promise to yourself and let it dry like ink forgotten on a crumbling wall? He walked along the edge of a field that once shimmered gold, now veiled by a heavy mist. He wasn't old, but a weariness sat in his eyes that belonged to neither youth nor age. It was the exhaustion of someone who had once been another and lost him somewhere along the road. In his arms he carried a small box, worn and lockless. He pressed it to his chest as if afraid someone might see what was inside, or the emptiness that might remain. The first time he heard the whisper of that promise was on a day when the wind danced with the leaves like it knew every secret time had ever kept. He was still a boy then, and the world felt like a table set just for him. He made a vow to the sky that he would never let that light go dim. But years passed like dust across a long road, and like so many, he forgot. In the village, few remembered his real name. They called him the one who stayed, for he remained there day after day, repeating gestures that no longer belonged to him. But each night, before sleep, he placed the box by his bed, as though waiting for it to speak, to return the lost sound of the vow. One day, when the silence had grown too thick for even birds to pierce, a child sat beside him and asked, "Why don't you open that box?" He smiled with the sorrow of someone who knows the answer, but fears to say it aloud. And in that moment, he realized, what hurt most wasn't that he had broken the promise, but that he pretended it never existed. That night, he dreamt of a field scattered with broken mirrors. Each shard reflected a part of him that had gone missing. The boy who wanted to paint the wind, the young man who wrote letters to a future that never replied, the one who stopped singing. He walked among the fragments barefoot, uncut, as if he somehow knew that even shattered, they still belonged to him. He woke with his heart beating slow and low, like a memory returning in hesitant steps. He looked at the box. There had never been a lock, just the fear of what might remain inside. He ran his fingers over the wood, and for a brief second, felt it pulse beneath his touch. Perhaps time hadn't taken everything after all. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift. The village still slept, but the trees stirred differently, as though listening. He rose slowly and returned to the place where he'd first heard the whisper of the promise. The field was drier than he remembered, yet beneath the soil, small seeds waited, unseen. He sat down, the box in his lap, and opened it with gentle hands. No gold, no letters, no photographs, just a single delicate feather, blue, curved, barely weight. And he smiled because he remembered. That feather belonged to a bird he had once followed as a child, convinced it would lead him to a place where no one forgot who they were. He had kept it as a sign, a compass of sorts. But somewhere along the way, he forgot how to fly. Holding the feather between his fingers, he closed his eyes. And for the first time in many years, he didn't feel lost, just returning. With the blue feather in hand, he began to walk again. His steps were slow, as though the old path had become sacred in his absence. The trees no longer stood indifferent. They bowed slightly, as if recognizing the traveler who once left without goodbye. He returned to the broken bridge where, long ago, he had stopped himself from crossing. Back then, he carried too many ideas, too many fears, too many versions of himself. Sitting on the weathered wood, he let the feather drift into the river. It floated with the grace of something unburdened by history. He smiled, not because the bridge was fixed, but because he no longer needed it to be. Later, he visited the patch of ground where he had buried his drawings, afraid no one would understand them. The soil still held the marks. With bare hands, he dug. The pages were damp but intact, filled with birds, faces, houses that never existed but always felt like home. He didn't weep. He simply breathed in deeply, gathering parts of himself left behind like forgotten tools. Finally, he approached the old wall where, as a teenager, he had written in charcoal, "Don't forget me." The words had faded, but something inside him answered quietly, "I've been here all along." The feather, now tied around his neck, moved softly with the wind. Not a symbol of flight, but of remembering he once knew how. As he walked back, He carried no drawings, no pages, no coal, only the silence of someone who had begun to hear his own voice again. The next morning, before the sun had fully opened its eyes, he returned to the field where the promise first whispered itself into being. This time the wind didn't come as a breeze, but as a breath deep enough to move through bone. In his hands he carried small seeds, some dry, some hesitant. He didn't know where they'd come from. Maybe they'd always been in the box unseen. Or perhaps they were born from the feather while he slept. He didn't ask. He just knelt. With slow fingers he carved shallow lines into the earth. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't orderly. Each seed was a word unsaid, a dream paused mid-flight, a gesture that never made it home. As he placed them in the soil, he made no new promises. Only this: I'm here. The field, once brittle, seemed to breathe beneath his knees. There were no signs, no applause, only sky and invisible roots, and a listening that didn't require language. When it was done, he sat among the furrows, his knees stained with dirt, his chest strangely light. The feather trembled gently against his skin, as if it could feel what he couldn't yet name. He closed his eyes, not to dream, but to listen. And what he heard was not wind nor bird song, but the deep sound of earth welcoming back what should never have been exiled. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't repair, it was tending. There, between silent seeds and the witnessing sky, he didn't reconnect with a mission, but with the part of him that had never stopped waiting. By late afternoon, the sky began painting colors he hadn't seen in years. Faded oranges, bashful purples, blues that seemed to rise from the ground rather than fall from the heavens. He sat beneath the oldest tree in the field and watched without rushing. The blue feather lay beside his chest still, and then he noticed something. The absence was gone. That quiet ache lodged beneath his ribs, the one he carried like a shadow, had vanished. In its place, space. Not emptiness, but room. Room for what could be. Room to stay. He stood and walked to the small circle of stones he had unknowingly shaped around the seeds. He placed the box, open, at the center. Not as an offering, not as a shrine, but as a home. Within its wooden frame now lived something unspoken, a silence made whole, a memory without sharpness, a gesture of returning without rewinding. He no longer needed to carry the box. It had done its part. As twilight deepened, he noticed a stir among the soil. A single sprout, so small it could be missed by anyone looking too fast. But he didn't move. He simply smiled, because he knew. What was sprouting wasn't a plant. It was a listening. Across the field, he heard soft footsteps. The child, the one who once asked about the box, was walking toward him, hands full of feathers. They sat together, wordless, and began to lay the feathers on the ground one by one, as if weaving an invisible path. He didn't ask where they came from. He simply helped. Night fell like a velvet cloth stitched by old hands. Stars appeared slowly, like eyes remembering how to open. He and the child remained in the field, placing feathers along the ground, the path twisting, uncertain, tender. A map to nowhere, or maybe a map back to himself. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was layered, thick with echoes of things once known. And within it, something began to lift from his chest. Not pain, but the weight of forgetting. The child stood. No signal, no words. Just rose and began to walk the feathered path, barefoot, bright-eyed. He hesitated, then followed. Not because he understood, but because something old inside him began to stir. Something made of vow and marrow. They walked until a small stone structure emerged at the edge of the dark. He didn't recognize it, but his body did. Each step closer felt like shedding years of dust. Inside, there was nothing but a wall of mirrors. Old, stained, quiet. He stepped closer and looked. What he saw wasn't the man he'd become, nor the boy he once was, but something in between. A third self, one without a name. It looked back at him, not with judgment but with invitation. No demands, no instructions. Only this: you're allowed to be whole again. And in that gaze, he understood. The promise he once made was never about achievement, or purpose, or proving anything. It was simply about staying true to the one he was, before forgetting set in. As he stepped out of the mirror house, the child was no longer by his side. But he didn't feel alone. Something within him had settled, not into stillness, but into belonging. The field, once brittle and forgotten, breathed with him now. The seeds below stirred softly, invisible to the eye, but alive in the dark. He sat beneath the old tree once more. The box, now part of the wind, lay open. The feather rested nearby, unmoving, not waiting but resting. For the first time he felt no need to close anything. Not the box, not the chapter, not the story. Some things don't need endings, only integration. He drew a word in the soil with his finger, a word he hadn't spoken in years. Returned. Not to a place, but to himself. The sky deepened, stars thickened, and within him something bloomed, a calm that didn't rely on answers, a quiet that no longer feared silence. The promises we break with ourselves don't vanish. They simply go quiet, curling into seed form, waiting for the day we remember how to listen. And when we do, they don't ask why we left. They don't scold. They just reach out their hand. He closed his eyes, and within the darkness, a single phrase rose. Soft, certain, whole. It is still time to return to what you never stopped being. Tonight, place an old object beneath your pillow. Let it hold the echo of what you once promised in silence. The path knows how to find you.